And this project is essentially about investment during financial crisis. The objective is to understand what are the real effects of credit when these events happen. So why do we care about the investment? So we actually know that investment is an important volatile and pro-cyclical component of output. But nevertheless, when we think about financial crisis, it seems that this pro-cyclicality of investment relative to GDP is even stronger. So it seems that financial crises are actually associated with even stronger declines of investment. So this may be related with the fact that banks are weak, so they lend less to consumers. So they also generate less demand for firms' products, and that will influence investment. Or it may be the case that we have a shutdown of a direct credit effect to firms. So these may actually generate this type of very large declines of investment during financial crisis. So essentially in this paper, we try to answer the question of how much do credit constraints contribute to this type of investment slumps during financial crisis specifically. And to answer this question, we go over the Greek financial crisis. This seems to be like an ideal setting to study these type of questions, mostly because we have a very clear investment cycle. So for firms, so first we have a period of expansion from more or less 2002 till 2007. Then a mild recession, and finally a very strong recession. For the data that we have available for this study, we actually consider this big contraction period as the years that go from 2010 till 2014. Now, there's also other characteristics on this crisis that is important for the scope of our studies. We have a very clear banking crisis, so these may actually have forced firms to deleverage, thus affecting investment. We also have, for this particular setting, very detailed firm level data, so this will allow us to have enough granularity to control for profitability, investment opportunities, and leverage. So just for you to have an overview of the magnitudes associated with this Greek crisis, I am plotting here the path of real GDP during that event for Greece, and we observe about more or less about a 25% fall of GDP in Greece over that particular period, so starting from 2008. We can also see that this is an event that is much larger in magnitude than what we observe in the Great Recession for the US on the same period, where GDP fell by almost 5%, but then it started to recover. In terms of the dimension of this crisis, this is more similar to what we have in the Great Recession. Now, at the same time, we also have like some information on credit that was supplied overall to the economy in that particular period. And while in the Great Recession in the US, we indeed observed like some kind of contraction of that other type of financial instruments to firms, we instead actually had like a continuous decline of that same indicator for the case of Greece. So indeed, you know, this suggests that we have indeed an important financial crisis going on in Greece for this particular period. So essentially, then we actually ask our main research questions in this paper. So the first research question just says that if we actually take into account in a particular model of firm investment only factors that are related with real type of variables, so essentially profitability, variation in taxes, even variations in volatility for this particular period, we cannot replicate the observed fall of investment in this particular period. So part of the reason why this is the case is that we actually have a lot of heterogeneity on profitability shocks. So these will give us investment opportunities for firms, where essentially we also observe that many firms went over that particular period of the crisis with positive sales growth. But nevertheless, overall, we observe a decline of investment rates in that period. So, for example, we have that exporting firms in Greece, in the manufacturing sector in Greece, in that particular period, they actually went relatively well in that period of the crisis, but they still declined or reduced their investment rate in more or less the same rates as what non-exporting firms have. So we then actually try to have credit constraints in this model of firm investment. And indeed, we can at least partially explain a larger chunk of this slump of investment. So essentially what is happening is that this contraction on credit forces firms to deleverage. And by doing so, these firms will forego some potential positive investment opportunities. So we then actually try to estimate this model, and we find that about 31% of the fall of investment that we observe in the data can be accounted to indeed variations in credit supply that are exogenous to firm conditions. So this is more or less as much as profitability conditions or variables associated with the real part of our economy. So how do we answer these questions? So let me just give you a very brief detail of the study that we do in this paper. So we've used like this census firm level data for the Greek manufacturing sector. So this covers the period of the expansion as well as the contraction. And the methodology that we use consists in essentially estimating a structural dynamic model of firm investment so that we are able to decompose what is the component of this slump of investment that is due to real factors associated with firms, so profitability, variations in product demands, taxes, as well as factors that are specifically financial, so this reduction in credit, let's say, from banks. Now, just to give a very brief overview of the related literature, so there are usually two strands on related literature that we think are relevant for this paper. The first one is related with some macro studies that we have for the Greek depression. These are typical studies that use this type of DSG models to disentangle different forces associated with the crisis. They tend to find that fiscal policy, so essentially variation in demand conditions from the consumer side due to, for example, austerity, are actually prominent drivers of firm investment for this particular period. Now, the problem is that these studies also use aggregate data, so it makes very hard to separate credit supply from demand shocks. We know that, of course, if consumers are reducing their decisions to buy products from firms, then firms have less investment opportunities. So they will also invest less. So, here we can have like, a demand shock for credit that actually affects consumers that will then spill over into firms. The objective in our paper is essentially to separate the supply from demand of credit to these firms. Now, then we have a different type of papers in the literature that also study the role of credit on firm decisions. So these are studies that usually compare different decisions, either on investment or employment for different companies that actually have access to different type of banks in terms of different degrees also of financial health. By doing this comparison, so by essentially measuring the investment rate of a firm that borrows from a bank in a good health financial status relative to one with low health, these authors can actually try to find an estimate for different decisions associated with firms. The problem with this type of studies for let's say for the case of the Greek crisis is that that particular crisis was very was very broad, like in that particular country. And most of the banking sector in Greece was severely affected by that financial crisis. So it's hard to find these type of banks that were in good health in that particular event. So essentially, our methodology will try to overcome that by instead, modeling this type of credit supply shocks as a structural environment. So even if the shock on the banking sector is very common, so it affects all banks simultaneously, we can still say something about what is the impact of that particular force on firm decisions for our particular case investment. Okay, so let me just give you an idea of the data set that we have at hand. So the data that we use is from the Greek Statistical Agency. So this is essentially a census type of data that for manufacturing firms in Greece with at least 10 employees. It covers the years from 2002 till 2014, and this represents about half of the manufacturing employment in Greece. Now, the variables that are included in this data set includes firms' inputs and outputs. So this will allow us to think about different proxies for investment opportunities. Or in other words, it will allow us to somehow estimate variations in firm profitability or productivity. But then we also have some additional balance sheet data that will give us a way to think about decisions related with that for these firms. So essentially, we have a variable on sales, variable costs like labor and capital expenditures, debt, and some additional balance sheet equity that will support the analysis in this paper. So once we clean up the data for some clear mistakes, we actually end up with about 2,500 firms per year for this particular period. Let me actually jump immediately on what we have in the data. So when we actually look at firm level investment rate, we actually observed that this was quite stable during this initial period from 2002 till 2007 at about 11.5%. Now, after this period, we actually observed the slump of investment that we document in this work, where essentially this investment rate fell by 40%. So it went from 11.5 to about 5% in the peak of the crisis, so essentially 2012. Now, at the same time, we also observed that profitability conditions actually showed a very large dispersion during this crisis. So again, I will show you some data later on this presentation. But for example, these exporting firms that we can identify in our sample didn't do that badly in terms of sales growth and other proxies for these profit conditions during this particular period. So then it's a little bit puzzling why these firms are also reducing investment in this particular period. So one way to see this is just to run a regression of the investment rate on proxies associated with profitability conditions, sales growth, cash flows, and interactions. Also with some sectoral and year dummies, so that we can try to have a sense of what these real type variables, so variables associated with profitability, can explain from the crisis. So when we actually do that, we observe that they explain very little of the fall of the investment rate. So in the data, this fall of the investment rate in the particular crisis is about the 40%. These variables associated with variations in sales and cash flows cannot account for more than 15% of that fall. Now there are like different ways. Okay, so also at the same time, we observe that leverage or firm leverage in the sample, so this is mostly financial and real debt that we have in in our data divided by the total equity, the total asset side of the firm. This was also relatively stable up until 2008, 2007, but then it actually started declining continuously over the crisis period. Again, this is very homogeneous across different type of firms that we also have in the sample. So this is some suggestive evidence against an all real interpretation of the crisis, saying that indeed there was an important role for credit, perhaps to explain this investment rate. So let me actually try to convince you that this is the case by showing some additional empirical results. So the type of regressions that I already showed you before in the figure can be done by just evaluating investment or regressing investment against controls. These controls typically try to identify different type of firm level conditions in terms of profitability, investment opportunities. So these are usually the fundamentals or the real side variables for the firm. So log sales, cash flows, interactions of these variables. But then we also use these crisis dummies to see if there is some additional factors that are not captured by these variables to explain the variation of the investment rate. Now, when we actually run these type of regressions, and let's just focus here on our first column of these regression results, we observe that the dummy variables associated with the crisis can account for about 4.9 percentage points decline of the investment rate during the crisis. And this is even after controlling for all these real type of variables. So this accounts for about 50% of the observed fall of the investment rate. So there is like a large chunk of something that is unexplained when we look at the investment rate for this particular period. Now, when we actually try to investigate a little bit what is behind this unexplained part of the fall of the investment rate, one idea that is also suggested by how leverage is actually evolving in that particular period is to say that this is related with financial conditions. So in a next regression, we actually correlate or interact with this dummy variable, an index that captures how different sectors are dependent on external finance. So this is this can be done using this Rajan and Zingales index. So this is just a variable used in the literature to measure the importance of credit for different type of sectors, defined as the difference between investment and variable profits relative to investment. We see that interacting this variable on our dummy crisis indeed generates some additional explanation on the fall of the investment rate. So the idea is that sectors that are more dependent on external finance were also more severely affected during the crisis in terms of their investment rate. Now, one final piece of reduced form evidence that we show in this paper is by comparing different firms as they enter the crisis in terms of how much leverage they carried and how that actually impacted investment. So essentially here, we run similar type of regressions where we separate firms between high leverage firms and low leverage firms. So firms that actually enter the crisis with a leverage level in the top tertile, or with these high levels of debt relative to equity, are also the firms where we observe the most intense decline of investment in this period. So essentially, just to summarize, to wrap up this evidence, It seems that the crisis was associated with lots of heterogeneity, especially on investment opportunities. So some firms, indeed, they seem to have some very important and profitable conditions during the crisis, but nevertheless, investment is being reduced across the board. It seems that these financial variables have a role at explaining that variation of investment. So our next step is essentially to try to estimate what is the quantitative importance of that during the crisis. Okay, so how will we do that in here? So essentially, we'll use a relatively standard model of heterogeneous firm investment. The model will account for investment with firm heterogeneity. So essentially, we'll have different levels of capital and debt for different firms. We will have also some idiosyncratic profitability shocks. So this will generate natural demand for both capital and debt. And on top of that, we will also add some common shocks trying to reflect the progression of the crisis in this particular period. In particular, we will add an aggregate shock on profitability and also an aggregate uncertainty shock. So this aggregate uncertainty shock is to capture some potential drivers on investment that may arise from additional volatility that we have in that particular period. Okay. Now, on top of these real type of variables, so variables associated with profitability, with productivity and product demand, we will also add two financial frictions. So one is costly equity finance, the other is a collateral constraint. So these are relatively common in the literature. This is what we will use essentially to generate space in the model to allow us to estimate the importance of the credit supply during the crisis. Just to give you like an overview of how these different elements fit into the model. Firms in our model generate some cash flow from or some dividends or like some cash at end by generating some profit. So we will have like a profit function. On top of that, they will have like some capital expenditures and some additional cash flows that come from the accumulation of that period by period. Now, we also have here a tax rate. So this is the corporate tax rate that will reduce the availability of this cash flow, but part of this tax will then be rebated to the firm. So we also take into account the fact that firms receive back the part of the capital expenditure that depreciates every period, as well as an additional tax rebate associated with interest expenditures every period. So we have like this function associated with the firm dividend every period. Capital is accumulated in this model, through a standard investment accumulation equation. But these equations, so these investment decision carries convex and non-convex adjustment costs. So we actually want to include these functions in here, mostly to be able to capture in a better way like different moments associated with the investment distribution that we have in our sample. Finally, this profit function will assume a relatively standard functional form. So we will have some curvature on capital and then our two profitability shocks, one that is idiosyncratic, the other that is aggregate. This functional form that we have in here can be derived from more standard models with monopolistic competition. We have a production function, some type of demand. So this is also very standard in the literature. Now, on top of that, we'll have the definition of our shocks in the economy. So the aggregate shock will follow an AR1 process, so similarly with our idiosyncratic shock for profitability. But then on top of that, to capture this idea of different levels of volatility during the crisis, we also add this shock on uncertainty for the firms, where essentially we have, or we can think about two periods, two potential states of the world associated with this uncertainty, a state with high uncertainty and a state with low uncertainty. In order to select these two states, we just use a standard Markov chain probability to identify the two shocks that we have in this environment. Now, in terms of the financial frictions, we have the two that I already mentioned. So on one end, firms cannot raise equity in this environment. This is reflected by the fact that this dividend or the cash flow that firms generate every period cannot go negative. If that happens, they need to leave directly the economy. On top of that, we will also have a relatively standard collateral constraint. Now, this collateral constraint says that debt in the next period cannot be larger than either the assets that firms have in the next period or the expected profit that firms make also in the next period. So this max that we have in here for our collateral constraint reflects essentially recent findings from Lian and Ma that says that firms, at least in the US, they not always borrow against the level of assets that they give to banks as collateral, but also against the variable profits or the profits that they can expectedly generate in the future. So essentially, we also allow our model to speak to these two sources of firm credit by including these two roles of or these two channels that may affect availability of debt for these firms. Okay. Now, this problem will admit a standard recursive problem. So every period, firms will be able to either adjust on their capital stocks or remain inactive. If firms adjust, then they need to pay this adjustment capital cost, and they can also select the amount of debt. Now, the value of inaction is essentially defined in very much the same way, but essentially firms don't have any type of adjustment cost. Because our adjustment cost includes these convex and non-convex factors, there will also be some lumpiness on investment decisions, so some regions associated with inaction. So just for you to have a sense of what this model generates, the policy functions associated with investment in our environment are relatively standard. So essentially, we observe like a declining investment rate with the stock of each firm's capital. At the same time, we also have that the investment rate increases with profitability, but now we have this additional role for credit. So essentially, firms that actually have higher levels of leverage, they will have similar type of policy functions for investment, but these will be reduced. So essentially, these firms will be not using these investment opportunities associated with firms that actually start each period with low levels of leverage. Now, how do we proceed then with the estimation of this model? So the model is relatively long, so he has 15 parameters. That would be very hard to estimate in a single step. So essentially divide our estimation into a three-step approach. So we first try to estimate all parameters that are static. So these are parameters associated with our profitability structure in the environment. We do this by just using some standard nonlinear GMM. Then with the estimations that we generate in this first step, we plug them into our dynamic investment and debt model to recover like this debt and these parameters associated with the remaining parts of our model. Now, finally, with these full set of model parameters, we try to recover the importance of credit supply shocks during the crisis by essentially matching the observed leverage that we have the observed leverage that we have in our data to shocks on the collateral constraint. So essentially, the shock on the collateral constraint that we have in our environment will mostly recover the excess variation in debt decisions that is unrelated with variations in these profitability conditions. So we will associate that residual to variations in credit for our firm. So estimates for the first stage, so these are the estimates associated with the profit function and profitability shocks. We just use some very standard GMM estimator. Now, on top of this, we also want to generate this volatility on uncertainty into a high and low level volatility. To do that, we use a more non-standard regime switch estimator as in Hamilton. But essentially, the data that we have at end doesn't generate that much action on variations on volatility. So you see here that the volatility of this profit shock just increases, at least in our estimation, just increases by about 10%. So this doesn't seem to be that large and much of a factor to explain this very large impact on investment that we observe in the data. All the remaining estimates are similar to what other people found in different studies. Now, for the second stage part of our estimation, we look at these. We actually plug in these first stage estimates in our dynamic model of investment, and we recover the remaining parameters of our model by just applying this simulated method of moments method. So this essentially consists in generating some moments in the model and comparing them with what we have in the data, and then we want to minimize that particular distance by choosing different levels of parameters. So essentially, the moments that we use to regulate these estimation process are moments informative about investment and debt that we have in our sample. So essentially, we will look at the investment rate, investment in action. So decisions where firms actually don't change their capital expenditure from one period into the other, positive investment spikes, negative investments, and the standard deviation of the investment rate. In terms of moments that try to capture some information on debt decisions associated with these firms, we actually use the average leverage and then a slope coefficient of leverage, or a correlation, if you want, of leverage against the changes in profitability. Now, the results that we generate from these exercise of estimation are relatively standard. Essentially, the model can, or the estimation can indeed capture most of the moments that we have in the data, and this applies both for investment moments as well as for debt-related moments that we have in the data. Now, these estimates are also not that surprising in comparison to other studies, similar studies that we have in the literature. So finally, we actually use this model to filter credit supply shocks during the Greek crisis. We do that by essentially matching the observed leverage that we have for each year separately that we have in our data for this period that goes from 2008 till 2014. Now, this is done by essentially adding this additional scale shock on our collateral constraint that will essentially allow the model to have a perfect matching, a perfect replication of this observed leverage that we have in the data. So this will be done by default. It's the only time series from the data that we actually match. We don't match directly investment in this particular period. We do this by adding this fee shock in here as a residual. So essentially, you know, our model will essentially integrate, or this third stage estimate will essentially integrate these driving real shocks that we estimated in the first stage. So these are the ones that we have in here. So variation in aggregate profitability. So these very large impacts early on in the crisis, and then a recovery. Also variations in volatility, variations in the corporate tax rate. The main targets will be targets associated with leverage that we have in our data. So we actually use two different targets. One that is essentially the raw accounting measure of leverage that we have directly for the firms. The second target actually tries to correct this raw leverage for the existence of some bad loans that banks may have not write off in that particular period. This is also related with the fact that it seems that this crisis period was also associated with a large increase in these non-performing loans. These are loans that shouldn't be essentially in the data, so we also try to correct for that. So we have essentially two series that we try to target associated with this leverage. We do that by estimating these shocks on the collateral constraint. So essentially, the shock that we generate using a visual representation is this credit supply shock. The credit supply shock tries to fit what we have in the data with what the model actually generates. By definition, this is almost a perfect fit. So indeed, we are finding an additional shock that completely rationalizes the observed variation that we have in our data for this average investment rate. Now, with these estimates done, we can then try to assess what is the role of credit to investment during this Greek crisis. We have essentially two different sources of shocks. So these are all real shocks and credit supply shocks. The effect of the credit supply shock on investment can be done by just using the policy functions on investment that we have in our model, and then we can shut down these investment here. I'm sorry, we can shut down the credit supply shock by essentially changing these FT relative to what we estimate in this exercise to one where it doesn't have any role. So essentially, this would capture credit conditions that Greek firms actually have before the crisis. So when we actually proceed with this decomposition, we observe, in the data, this 47% fall of the investment rate. If the model doesn't take into account this variation in credit supply during the crisis, so the shocks that are captured on the variable fee, the model cannot explain more than a 16% fall of the investment rate. So overall, this gives us about a 34% fit of the model when we actually don't take into account these credit supply shocks. Now, when we actually add this additional estimate that the model allows us to think of, then the explanation of this or the fit of the model that is explained by this additional shock increases to about 45 to 65%. So essentially, our firm investment and debt model, take into account this reduction in credit during the crisis, can account for about 45 to 65% of the fall of investment. Overall, these will represent, if we isolate credit, this represents that credit can account for, or just credit can account for about 11 to 32% of the fall of investment during this crisis period. Now, the model also allows us to estimate not just the year-to-year effect on the reduction in the investment rate, but also the cumulative reduction of the aggregate investment. These give us about 105 to 144% of a reduction of investment relative to the level of investment that we would have under a pre-crisis. This is much larger than what other authors found in the literature, also for financial crisis. For example, Schulerich and Taylor found that financial crises are usually associated with a cumulative decrease of investment of about 30 to 23%. This is what our model generates when we just think of credit conditions only. Okay. Now, one last thing that we do in this model is essentially a comparison of different subsamples in our data. So we can compare the exporting firms with the non-exporting firms. And we do this by essentially repeating this three-step estimation procedure into these two subsamples. Now, when we do that, we immediately observe that these two subset of firms, perhaps not surprisingly, have a very different path on profitability. So these exporting firms essentially observe that profitability is kind of increasing during that period. Non-exporting firms' profitability is instead declining. So these are firms that, not surprisingly, were more exposed to the negative consequences of, let's say, austerity policies that we observed in Greece in that particular period. So profitability also reflects that additional adverse conditions. But then when we look at the investment rate and leverage, we observe that for both type of firms, these are reducing at more or less the same level. Now, repeating this estimation process for both firms also gives us this type of credit supply shocks that seem to be very similar whether we are dealing with a sample of the non-exporters or exporters. So these essentially give us some notion that indeed this credit supply shock, this credit contraction that we observed during the Greek crisis was indeed a very common shock that affected most banks in our economy, and by implication, also the majority of firms, whether these firms actually have good investment opportunities or not so good, as the case of the non-exporting firms that we have in our sample. Okay, so just to conclude, I want to show you, and now that we actually have a model, just two type of policy experiments. So these were related with some debates that we actually have during that particular period. One policy that the government could actually try to use to stimulate investment in this period would be like a policy that may want to reactivate demand for these firms. For example, a sales subsidy policy for all firms. Another set of policies that were also discussed back in the Greek crisis were policies associated with dealing directly with these high leverage of certain firms. So in this exercise that I will show you, we will use like a reduction or a debt forgiveness type of policy. We will try to compare these two policies by essentially matching the budget cost for one particular year only of the two policies. So essentially, one is activating demand through a sales subsidy. The other is a reduction, a direct reduction of the debt burden in 2012. Now, when we do that, we observe that for a value-added policy or subsidy that essentially costs about 5.6% of GDP in this manufacturing sector, investment rate would indeed increase by about 11% in our baseline scenario. If you actually increase or decrease the severity of the crisis, doesn't really matter that much in terms of the effectiveness of this value-added subsidy policy. You know, things would change from 11 to about 13%. Now, things are actually different when we think about this debt relief policy. We know that these firms in this particular period in 2012, they were being severely affected by this credit contraction type of shock. So affecting that problem directly through a debt relief policy may be more effective. So this debt relief policy has exactly the same cost in terms of the government expenditure, but it seems that he has a larger bite on stimulating investment for this particular period. This is actually increasing, very increasing, when we actually also increase the severity of the crisis. So the idea is that there's like this non-linear effect of credit contraction on firms' decision. The larger is the severity of the crisis, the more firms will be indeed severely constrained by excess of credit. So relieving that will immediately allow firms to have access to more investment opportunities. So this investment rate will also increase. Okay. So this is also the path of these different policies, but we observe that, you know, for these more severe crises, the path of capital indeed is better if you use a debt relief policy relative to a sales subsidy policy. This essentially concludes this presentation. So we have shown that the Greek investment slump cannot just be explained by variation in demand and productivity conditions. A model with only profitability shocks can account for less than 1/3 of the observed fall of the investment rates. A credit contraction with firm deleveraging, so this is a typo, can actually match up to 65% of the observed fall of the investments. So this is about as much as what we have on the variation of these all real type of variables. Since both leverage and credit contraction seem to be explained, seem to be important to explain these investment collapses, then different policy implications should be at least studied in, with more detail. We can think about policies that try to support banks directly or firms directly in terms of debt relief, or we may even think about some macroprudential policies that try to avoid these excessive accumulation of leverage in normal periods, so that a period associated with the financial crisis cannot lead to these very large slumps in investment. So that's it for today. So thanks a lot for the presentation. If there are questions, I am more than happy to answer them.
Thank you to you, Tiago. We can switch to Spanish or keep in English.
Yeah, to Spanish.
Gracias, Tiago. Gracias por la presentación, muy interesante. Entendo que non me ves a cara, pero estou aquí. Vou abrir para preguntas, aínda que, mentras tanto, vou a facer ao mellor unha pequena reflexión e algunhas suxestións. Agradecerche antes de nada, Tiago, a presentación, porque en castellano, porque hablamos siempre contigo en castellano, siempre está muy bien mezclar distintos métodos de estimación, ¿no? Partes de un análisis econométrico más estándar, después vas a estimación no lineal GMM y finalmente pues hacer estos métodos simulados de momentos. Lo has vendido de forma muy humilde, pero a veces es bastante complejo llegar a tener una solución con estos métodos de estimación no lineales. Entonces te agradezco mucho todo el esfuerzo que has hecho, es muy interesante. Y especial también de interés es esto que has presentado al final, que es el policy design, ¿no? Estos distintos posibilidades por las cuales podíamos simular, ¿no? Estos experimentos. Bien, yo te quería hacer una pregunta con respecto a, Tiago, si verías interesante incluir lo que sería como el sentimiento en general de la economía en ese momento o lo que es la prima de riesgo, ¿no? Por ejemplo, pues en España cuando tenemos momentos circunstanciales en los cuales es mucho más caro acceder al crédito y esa prima de riesgo implica, bueno, presenta lo que es el coste adicional de crédito, pero a su vez también como es un indicador de sentimiento generalizado sobre la perspectiva económica y el futuro económico de esas empresas, ¿no? Eso por una parte. Y después también te quería preguntar si dentro de los datos de las empresas que tú tienes, has hecho muy bien dividir en aquellas que son exportadoras, de las que no lo son o no son tantos. Pero me gustaría también preguntarte, Tiago, si además de eso tienes datos sobre el tipo de management que tienen, para ver también incluso un poco la edad o las prácticas de management, porque yo creo que eso es muy importante y hay empresas que durante la crisis precisamente han pensado, bueno, una crisis siempre da lugar a una gran oportunidad, me voy a preparar con plan gran oportunidad, pues porque tenía un management más activo, más dinámico, etcétera, mientras que no tú demuestras y la media, pues definitivamente no ha sido el caso. Entonces, estas son dos pequeñas preguntas para que abrir el espacio a mis compañeros para que hagan las preguntas y anotaciones o sugerencias que consideren pertinentes, pero mi felicitación a ti y a tus colaboradores por tu trabajo, que es excelente, muy interesante y me gustó mucho ver tanto lo que son las distintas aplicaciones empíricas como es el experimento. Me gustó mucho esa simulación, está muy bien. Así que muchas gracias, Tiago.
So should I answer right now or okay, so
claro, a lo mejor
quizá
hay más preguntas.
voy a continuar en inglés apenas para
sí,
que
ya respondí en inglés.
no, puede ser en español, pues ya me tengo que acostumbrar. Ok, pero ¿respondo ya o espero por más?
¿Alguna pregunta, algún otro comentario, alguna otra pregunta, sugestión, idea?
Ok, sí, pues tengo aquí como una también en el chat, pero sí, pues empiezo por tus comentarios y cuestiones, María. Pues cuanto al sentimiento, pues yo creo que esto puede ser interpretado de diferentes formas. Una es como un poco más reduced form, pues que hay cualquier cosa de animal spirits que afectan estas firmas durante crises financieras. Y en verdad, nuestro modelo intenta como capturar un poco esa potencial variación de sentimiento, de confianza de empresarios durante este tipo de crisis. Y tenta hacerlo como a través de estos choques que incluimos en la volatilidad. Esses choques que incluimos en la volatilidad de este shock a lo lucro de la empresa. Este choque é um choque que Nick Bloom é usado muitíssimo nos últimos anos. E é precisamente um choque que tenta capturar que quando existe um incremento de incertidumbre, por exemplo, devido a variações de sentimento ou animal spirits, as firmas tendem a inversionar menos e este é um efeito que ele denomina de wait and see. Bien, nosotros intentamos incluir y estimar también ese choque, pero parece que no es suficiente para explicar estas muy largas magnitudes de la variación de inversión. Por isso, pues, tenemos que adicionar más cosas al modelo y estimarlas como los choques que tenemos en el crédito. Pues que también hablaste del risk premium. Eso sí, pues es un punto muy importante, el hecho que cuando las condiciones económicas se tornan peores, firmas tenden a estar más en riesgo de simplemente no pagar. Isso implica que os bancos naturalmente, de uma forma bem racional, que em verdade vão acortar o crédito a essas firmas, seja por via da quantidade, seja por via de preços, pois vão cobrar como taxas de interesse mais elevadas por esse crédito. Em verdade, este modelo ignora completamente essa parte de variações via incrementos da taxa de interesse. Aún así, pues apenas se concentra apenas en variaciones de crédito por el efecto de la cantidad. Aún así, pues en el apéndice del paper, hacemos exatamente esse modelo que sugieres, como un robustness check, aonde pues permitimos que el precio del crédito, o sea, la tasa de interés, cambie mediante essas firmas estão mais ou em menos risco de entrar em bancarrota e não pagar. Finalmente, pues hay la cuestión del management, pues que sí es una muy buena cuestión, sugerencia. Infelizmente, pues no tenemos datos sobre eso, pues los datos que tenemos es esencialmente balance sheet and financial statement información. O sea, no, pues no tenemos ni siquiera como las características de quién detiene estas firmas, de quién está como haciendo el management. Entonces no podemos, no tenemos nada a decir. Quizá el único que se puede decir es que probablemente estos fueron los mismos managers que tenían las firmas durante este periodo de expansión. Y mientras se quedaron con las firmas durante el periodo de recesión para la crisis financiera en Grecia. O sea, pues, dito esto, mi interpretación de lo que en este modelo está potencialmente absorbiendo de una forma como muy imprecisa, clara, ese tipo de efectos de management, es precisamente estas variaciones que tenemos aquí en lo que he llamado de profitability shocks. O sea, estos profitability shocks, sea agregados o idiosincráticos, esencialmente capturan como variaciones exógenas para nosotros, quizá no para las firmas, de efectos asociados con variaciones de productividad o demanda por productos de empresas, que firmas también, al menos en el modelo, lo ven como exógeno.
Pues muchas gracias, Tiago. Parece que ya has pensado en muchas cosas,
No, pues muchas cosas, pues debería...
Una pregunta más, si puedo.
Sí,
claro, Carlos, adelante.
Sí, antes habíamos hablado que este trabajo puede ser replicado, extendido a datos de Portugal y tal vez de España, ¿no?
Y para España, creo que sí. Embora España, sí hay unas bases de datos que verifican ese tipo de o que esencialmente tienen lo mismo contenido de información relativamente a la base de datos que tenemos en este artículo. Entonces, sí, pues este ejercicio seguramente podría ser hecho para España. Sabemos que el crédito en España en ese periodo también fue muy importante. Pues yo no tengo tanta la idea si las firmas en España están tan abiertas o tan expuestas, por ejemplo, a mercados internacionales como firmas en Grecia, que acaba por ser una economía más pequeña, Grecia, España una economía más grande. Isso como dá-nos variação de estas investment opportunities or profitability conditions que podem influenciar ou que podem ajudar como a determinar a importância destes choques de crédito. Pero sí, este ejercicio podría ser hecho para España, quizá de una forma más interesante para otro tipo de sectores, porque nosotros apenas teníamos acceso a manufacturing firms. Sabemos que en España, como creo que 2000, a partir de 2009, una parte considerable de la economía estaba asociada a firmas de construcción, de real estate y ese tipo de actividad económica. Pues podría estar interesante como hacer un ejercicio así para ese tipo de firmas que claramente tienen como un shock de procura muy grande, pues la gente dejó de comprar tantas casas y a precios más bajos, pero simultáneamente también parece que hubo una grande deleveraging en ese mismo periodo.
Muy bien,
entonces, pues, estaría bien interesante también hacer este tipo de trabajo para España.
¿Y recogéis información de las empresas que podemos llamar las empresas zombie, que sobreviven pero como sin producir o sin...
Sí. Sí, no, pues eso es, que está relacionado pues también con crisis financieras, es algo que estamos intentando hacer. Y esto resulta quizá un poco más del lado de los bancos, en que muchos bancos, por motivos regulatorios, tienden a tardar el asumir de pérdidas que ya saben que van a acontecer a firmas, precisamente para no tener a ver que decir al regulador que ya tienen que sacar más capital de otro tipo de fuentes, porque los créditos que prestaron pues ya son malos. Entonces sí, pues muchas veces estos bancos que continúan a mantener estas firmas activas, mismo cuando ya saben que estas firmas están cerca de la falencia. El problema de este tipo, y sí, pues ahí hay como esa emergencia de lo que se llama zombie firms y pues firmas que deberían pues, desaparecer. El problema es que esto también genera mucha malalocación, misallocation de recursos, pues ahí tenemos como firmas que están a sobrevivir, que están a usar capital y factores de trabajo. También factores financieros que podrían ser usados más eficientemente quizá para otras firmas que tienen niveles de productividad más elevados. Entonces, sí, pues al menos en esta base de datos de Portugal, también en esta de Grecia, observamos claramente como un incremento de medidas relativamente estándar de misallocation de recursos, misallocation of capital y misallocation of labor, que parece ser sugestivo que ese tipo de zombie landing se tornó más importante en ese periodo.
Muchas gracias. Fantástica presentación.
Pues que tenga aquí una cuestión más de Jorge Pérez. Entonces apenas... María, ¿se crees que todavía...
sí, adelante, por supuesto, además. Por supuesto que sí, adelante, que no puedo ver, se me congeló. Ahora
no,
sí.
que está en el chat y sí, pues Jorge me pregunta si...
the conclusions in this research could be enhanced by the by decomposing the debt, right, between bank loans and others.
Ok. No, sí. Yeah. Ok, no, pues gracias Jorge por la cuestión. Pues sí, en verdad creo que tienes razón. Y tenemos alguna información sobre la estructura del crédito que firmas tienen acceso en este periodo. Un tipo de crédito que se secó como prácticamente al 100%, que observamos en los datos, es esencialmente como equity issuance, o sea, como crédito que deviene del hecho que los dueños de la empresa pues que entren con más capital financiero. Pues por eso también adicionamos esta restricción en nuestro modelo, que firmas no pueden tener como cash flows que fueron negativos, que implicarían esencialmente que las firmas estaban como cargando más equity para financiar deudas o inversiones. Pero también pues haces cuestiones de otro tipo de instrumentos de crédito que son más de mercado, como securities y bonds para esas empresas. La cuestión es que Grecia en este aspecto es un poco más como Alemania y un poco menos como el Reino Unido o Estados Unidos. Gran parte del crédito empresarial en Grecia, como la gran parte, más del 90%, y seguramente para firmas de estructura mediana, pequeña, mismo grande, pero no gigante, es crédito de bancos, es literal crédito de bancos. Aún así, pues nosotros queríamos también checar eso de issuances relacionadas con firm bonds and securities, y lo que observamos es que entre 2010 o 2000, un poco antes, 2009 y 2014, y esto es muy impresivo, pues bond issuances en Grecia pasaron literal a casi cero. Pues representaban ahí ese 5% del crédito total. Pero en ese periodo que fue de 5% para cero, entonces pues estamos muy confiantes que esas firmas simplemente no tenían acceso a market securities and loans.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Tiago. Si os parece bien, tomando así también un poco el comentario de Jorge para concluir, lo que a lo mejor sí es muy interesante o sería interesante es controlar por el tamaño de la empresa, ¿no? Empresas más grandes tienen más acceso a crédito, más profesionalidad, mejor management, probablemente aunque no sean, que no estén públicamente en determinados pues, plazas, ¿no? Que no haya trading de ellas, pues aún así seguro que tienen un management mucho más profesional, mientras que empresas más familiares, o mejor dicho, empresas pequeñas, porque en Galicia tenemos empresas familiares multinacionales, pero empresas más pequeñas a lo mejor tienen un management más conservador, más, ¿no? Con más dificultades para acceder a otro tipo de técnicas de financiación que no sea exclusivamente el bank loan. Entonces, te agradecemos de verdad, Tiago, todo lo que nos has presentado, súper interesante. Esperamos verte pronto por Vigo, por ECOBAS. ECOBAS es tu casa y aquí quedamos. Muchísimas gracias por tu presentación, excelente presentación. Muchas gracias a las personas que estuvieron hoy.